In the year 1666, the same year the Great Fire reduced London to smoldering ash, a man named Joseph Truman walked into a small brewhouse on a muddy lane in East London. He had nothing but a trade and a determination. What he could not have known was that on that single plot of marshy ground, beside what would eventually become one of the most famous streets in Britain, he was laying the first stone of what would grow into the single largest brewery in the entire world. Walk through the Spitalfields district in the mid-19th century and you cannot escape it. The chimney alone dominates the skyline for half a mile in every direction. 12 acres of red brick and iron stretching across streets so completely that the brewery simply swallowed the lanes whole. Monmouth Street, George Street, Black Eagle Street, all absorbed into one roaring, steaming industrial fortress. Inside, hundreds of workers move in synchronized rhythm. Horses pull barrel-laden wagons down cobblestone yards. The smell of roasting malt hangs over everything. At its absolute peak, the Black Eagle Brewery of Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company produced 400,000 barrels of beer every single year. Think about that number, 400,000. It was the largest output of any single brewery anywhere on the planet. Not just in Britain, not just in Europe, on Earth. The operation supplied the British Army, the East India Company, the royal household, and the courts of St. Petersburg. Charles Dickens knew the name well enough to drop it into David Copperfield as a symbol of almost incomprehensible wealth and ambition. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Walk down Brick Lane today and the building is still there. The old chimney still stands, the Black Eagle still carved above the archway, the Victorian brickwork still solid and defiant. But the brewing stopped, the fires went cold, the barrels stopped rolling. In 1989, after 323 continuous years of brewing in East London, the doors closed forever. So how does the mightiest brewery in the world simply cease to exist? How does 3 centuries of tradition, royal patronage, and industrial genius collapse into silence in just a few decades? This is the story of Truman's Brewery, its improbable birth in the ashes of the Great Fire, its ascent to global supremacy, its betrayal at the hands of corporate raiders who cared nothing for beer and everything for property, and its ghost, still haunting Brick Lane to this very day. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. We have a remarkable story ahead, over 3 centuries of history, ambition, beer, and betrayal. Let's begin. 1666. Brick Lane, Spitalfields, London. London is still smoldering. The Great Fire has just consumed 87 churches, 13,000 homes, and the medieval heart of the city. Refugees huddle in the fields beyond the city walls. Smoke drifts east across Spitalfields, settling on the marshy ground locals call Lolesworth Field, a patchwork of market gardens, small holdings, and modest workshops at the very edge of the known city. It is here, in this unsettled, half-built fringe of London, that a brewer named Thomas Bucknall constructs a small brewhouse. The location makes perfect sense. Brewing, with its fierce fires and powerful smells, was traditionally pushed downwind of the city, and here, on what will one day become Brick Lane, the prevailing winds carry the stench eastward, away from wealthy noses. In that same year of 1666, a young man named Joseph Truman begins working in Bucknall's brewhouse. The exact circumstances of their meeting are lost to time, but what is certain is that Truman is not merely a laborer, he is a manager. A strategist, a man who understands that this rough patch of East London is about to become something entirely different. When Bucknall dies in 1679, Joseph Truman acquires the lease of the brewhouse, the granary, the stables, and the surrounding land. He immediately sets about expanding. In 1694, he secures a second lease on land to the east of Brick Lane, doubling the footprint of the operation in a single transaction. What had been one man's modest venture is now a genuine brewery, straddling both sides of what will become the most famous lane in East London. Joseph Truman runs the brewery until his death in 1719. By then, the business is a recognized, profitable concern, far beyond anything Bucknall could have imagined. He leaves it to his sons, first to the eldest Joseph Jr., and then, within a few years, to the younger son, Benjamin. It is a decision that changes everything. But here's the thing. In 1719, the brewery is still small, competent, modestly successful. The industry itself is still relatively limited. No one has yet discovered how to make beer that travels. No one has yet unlocked the formula for mass production. The revolution is coming, and it will make Benjamin Truman one of the most powerful industrialists in all of Britain. The streets of Spitalfields are filling up. Huguenot silk weavers, fleeing religious persecution in France, are arriving in their thousands and settling around Brick Lane. They bring with them new tastes, new techniques, and a particular appreciation for well-hopped beer. The audience for what Benjamin is about to build is already gathering at his doorstep. What he doesn't know yet is that he is standing at the beginning of a revolution. 1722. Brick Lane, Spitalfields. Benjamin Truman joins the family business as a partner in 1722, aged roughly 22 years old. He arrives not as a humble apprentice, but as a driven commercial mind, already studying the ledgers, learning the supply chains, and asking hard questions about why the brewery is not growing faster. The answers lie not within the brewery walls, but in the streets of London itself, specifically in the hands of the men who carry loads across the great markets of Covent Garden, Billingsgate, and Smithfield. These men are called porters, and they are about to give their name to a drink that will make Benjamin Truman extraordinarily rich. Porter, the dark, heavily hopped beer brewed from brown malt, arrives in London in the early 18th century almost by accident. The story goes that a landlord at the Old Blue Last in nearby Shoreditch asked his brewer to produce a single beer ready mixed, a drink that combined 3 separate ales his market porter customers were forever ordering together. Whether that precise tale is true or embellished, the result is beyond dispute. Porter is the first beer in British history that can be brewed in vast industrial quantities without spoiling. It is stable, it is strong, it is cheap, and London's working population cannot get enough of it. Benjamin Truman recognizes the opportunity immediately. He invests aggressively. New copper vessels, expanded fermenting rooms, a growing workforce, more land adjoining the brewery. By 1748, the Black Eagle Brewery is the 3rd largest porter brewer in all of London, producing 40,000 barrels every single year. 3rd largest in a city that is at this moment the commercial capital of the world is not a modest achievement. It is extraordinary. But Benjamin is not content with 3rd, and he has a weapon none of his competitors can match: his personal relationship with the royal family. In 1737, when the Duchess of Brunswick is born and the Prince of Wales orders a public celebration outside Carlton House, it is Truman's beer that fills the barrels placed in the street for the rejoicing crowd. The first barrels are rejected with complaints. The prince orders a second supply, and this time requests Truman specifically. The crowd, the story goes, is entirely satisfied. Then something else happens that lifts Benjamin Truman into a different category entirely. King George III knights him, Sir Benjamin Truman, in recognition of his voluntary contributions of war loans to the crown. Thomas Gainsborough paints his portrait. The brewer from Brick Lane is now part of the British establishment. His beer is served in royal palaces. His name is spoken in Parliament. The empire is being built one barrel at a time, but the foundations are about to need new hands. Benjamin is growing old, and he has no son to inherit what he has created. The next chapter of Truman's story will be written by men outside the family entirely, and they will push the brewery to heights Benjamin himself never imagined. 1780, then 1808, Brick Lane, London. On the 20th of March, 1780, Sir Benjamin Truman dies. He leaves no male heir, a fact that might have spelled the end of the dynasty he spent his life constructing. Instead, he divides the brewery among his grandsons and passes the operational management to his head clerk, a trusted man named James Grant. Grant is competent enough, but lacks the transformational energy the business needs. When Grant himself dies in 1788, his share is purchased by a Quaker merchant named Sampson Hanbury, who has been a silent partner since 1780. The Truman family becomes sleeping partners. A new era begins. Hanbury is methodical, demanding, and relentlessly professional. He insists on the highest quality raw materials. He overhauls the accounts. He restructures the supply chain. And in 1805, he makes the single most consequential purchase in the brewery's history up to that point. He buys the brewery's first steam engine. The machine changes everything. Where before the brewery was limited by the physical strength of its men and horses, now it is powered by industrial force. Output climbs. Distribution reaches further across the country. The Black Eagle label begins appearing in pubs hundreds of miles from Brick Lane. Porter production, which stood at 100,000 barrels in 1800, doubles to 200,000 by 1820. Then, in 1808, Hanbury's nephew arrives. His name is Thomas Fowell Buxton. He is 22 years old, fresh from a glittering academic career at Trinity College, Dublin, and he is about to become one of the most remarkable figures in Victorian Britain. At the brewery, he is handed the ledgers first. He is sharp, organized, and immediately identifies inefficiencies that Hanbury had missed. By 1811, he is a full partner. By the time Hanbury dies in 1835, Buxton is the effective head of the concern now known as Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company. But Buxton is not merely a businessman. He is a social reformer of the highest order. At the brewery, he ensures his employees cannot work Sundays. He employs a schoolmaster and instructs every worker that in 6 weeks' time, any man who cannot read and write will be dismissed, and then is so astonished by the men's determination that not a single dismissal proves necessary. He is elected to Parliament in 1818. He campaigns alongside William Wilberforce for the abolition of slavery, eventually taking over leadership of that cause after Wilberforce's death and seeing it through to the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. Meanwhile, the brewery keeps growing. In 1831, Buxton hosts what becomes the most famous dinner in Truman's history. 23 members of the cabinet, including Prime Minister Charles Grey and Lord Chancellor Henry Brougham, dine at the brewery. Lord Brougham insists the menu be replaced with beefsteaks cooked directly on the brewery boiler furnace, washed down with Truman's porter. It becomes legend. The brewery is no longer just a business. It is an institution, a landmark, an empire, and it is still growing. 1853, Brick Lane, London. Stand at the corner of Brick Lane in 1853 and tilt your head back. The brewery chimney rises against the London sky like a great industrial monument. The site now covers 6 full acres. Whole streets have been absorbed into the complex. Monmouth Street, George Street, Black Eagle Street, all swallowed by the relentless expansion of the brewery over the previous 180 years. Inside, the cooperage hammers ceaselessly, producing the barrels that will carry Truman's beer across Britain and beyond. The stables house over 100 horses. The wagons roll out each morning and return each evening on a precise mechanical schedule. Everything is integrated, everything is controlled, everything is enormous. By 1853, the Black Eagle Brewery is producing 400,000 barrels of beer annually. No brewery anywhere in the world produces more. Not in Germany, not in Belgium, not anywhere in the British Isles. Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company is, without any contest, the largest brewery on earth. It is a fact of such staggering industrial achievement that Charles Dickens uses the name in David Copperfield as a byword for almost mythological success. In the novel, the ever-optimistic Mrs. Micawber declares that the profits of such firms are, and she stretches the word, enormous. The export operation is remarkable. Truman ships beer to the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. It supplies the British Army on campaign. It has a contract with the East India Company, meaning its beer travels to India and beyond aboard the great trading vessels. One particular product, an export imperial stout originally developed for the Russian court in St. Petersburg, is eventually deemed so excellent that it enters the domestic market as well. The pub estate is growing in parallel. By the early 20th century, Truman's will own and supply over 1,000 tied public houses across London and East Anglia. Every one of those pubs is a guaranteed customer, a guaranteed outlet, a guaranteed revenue stream. The business model is vertically integrated in a way that would be studied by business schools a century later. The problem is, and it is a problem not yet visible from the outside, the world is about to change faster than any brewery can comfortably adapt. The railway that opened in 1839 has connected Burton-upon-Trent in the English Midlands to the rest of the country, and Burton's brewers have discovered something remarkable. Their water, naturally rich in calcium sulfate, produces a pale ale of extraordinary clarity and crispness, a beer utterly unlike porter, a beer the British public is falling in love with. Meanwhile, something even harder to see is stirring. In the back rooms of Parliament, in the pages of social reform tracts, in the conversations of temperance campaigners, a slow tide of opinion is turning against the power of the great breweries. The era of unchallenged dominance is approaching its limits. Nobody inside the brewery knows it yet, The barrels keep rolling, the chimney keeps smoking, the empire feels permanent. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We are only halfway through the rise of this remarkable empire, and the fall is something you do not want to miss. 1860 to 1873, Burton-upon-Trent and Brick Lane. The problem with success is that it makes you conservative. By the 1860s, Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company is so large, so profitable, and so deeply entrenched in its existing operation that change feels dangerous. And yet change is precisely what is required. The British drinking public has made its verdict clear. Porter, the dark, heavy, roasted beer that built the empire on Brick Lane, is falling out of fashion. The new desire is for pale ale. Clear, crisp, golden, effervescent. The sort of beer that had been impossible to brew consistently until the railways brought Burton's mineral-rich water into the national conversation. The problem for Truman's is geological and not easily solved. Brick Lane's water supply comes from the London Basin, soft, mineral-light groundwater that produces excellent porter and stout, but cannot replicate the hard, sulfate-rich water of the Midlands. The chemistry simply does not work. Truman's attempts to produce pale ale at Brick Lane are technically inferior to what the Burton brewers are turning out by the barrel load. Bass, Allsop, Salt, the Burton giants, are sending their products down the railway to London and selling them faster than they can brew them. The obvious solution is to establish a presence in Burton. Truman's management approaches the Burton brewers with proposals for agency agreements, partnerships that would allow the London company to sell pale ale without having to brew it themselves. The approaches are rejected. The Burton brewers are not interested in sharing their advantage with a London rival, no matter how large and prestigious. So Truman's does something bold. In 1873, the company purchases the Phillips Brewery in Burton-upon-Trent outright. They hire the finest brewery architects and engineers in the nation, tear down the existing structures, and entirely reconstruct the Burton site from the ground up. It is a massive capital investment, the sort that strains even a business with Truman's resources. And it works in the most dramatic way imaginable. The acquisition of the Phillips Brewery makes Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company, at least briefly, the largest brewery operation in the entire world. The Burton Brewery struggles in its first years. The logistics of running two major operations simultaneously, hundreds of miles apart, prove more complex than anticipated. But by 1880, Burton is turning a profit, and the pale ale Truman's produces there is gaining ground in the London market. Then, quietly, the first cracks appear. The pub estate, which is supposed to guarantee revenue, is becoming a liability. Public house leases are expensive. The licensing laws introduced under Gladstone are restrictive. The old porter vats must be dismantled and replaced with new equipment suited to pale ale production. Every change costs money, and the sources of finance are growing harder to manage. Something is happening to the foundations. Not enough to cause alarm, not yet. But the empire that looked permanent in 1853 is no longer quite as solid as it appears. 1888, Brick Lane, London. By 1888, the financial strain is real and it is acknowledged. The brewery site on Brick Lane now covers 6 acres of Victorian engineering. The Burton Brewery is active and productive. The pub estate encompasses hundreds of tied houses. The workforce numbers in the thousands. And all of it requires capital. Constant, substantial, unrelenting capital investment. The partners cannot raise what is needed from within the partnership alone. The decision is made. In 1888, Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company becomes a public limited company. For the first time in its more than 200-year history, the brewery sells shares to external investors. The flotation raises the funds required in the short term. New money flows in. The brewery continues to operate, to expand, to maintain its formidable presence on the London market. But something shifts with that decision, something subtle and at the time seemingly unimportant. The brewery is no longer the property of a small group of committed partners who live and breathe brewing. It is now accountable to shareholders, people whose interest in the Black Eagle is measured not in barrels or in the quality of the malt, but in dividends and asset values. That distinction will matter enormously, but not yet. At the close of the 19th century, Truman's remains genuinely dominant. The Brick Lane site alone covers 6 acres by 1898, 11 acres in total when surrounding land is accounted for. The Victorian buildings that rise across those acres are magnificent examples of industrial architecture. The Great Engine House of 1867, the Vat House with its cast-iron columns and distinctive clock tower, the Boiler House with its soaring chimney. These structures speak of permanence, of confidence, of empire. And into the 20th century, the brewery moves with a certain momentum that carries it through the early decades without serious crisis. Truman's grows its pub estate further, buying out suppliers during the First World War when raw material control becomes critically important. It invests in motorized vehicles to replace the famous dray horses, a development mourned by romantics but welcomed by accountants. The wagons give way to lorries, the horses are retired. Progress of a sort continues. But the world outside the brewery walls is changing in ways that will prove far harder to manage than logistics or capital. A new kind of competition is coming. Not from Burton, not from London rivals, from the continent, from the boardrooms of hotel companies and property developers who have begun to look at the vast, ancient estates of British brewing and see not beer, but real estate. The 20th century has arrived, and it has brought with it forces that no amount of Victorian engineering can withstand. 1960 to 1971, Brick Lane, London. The 1960s are a decade of brutal consolidation for British brewing. Across the country, old family breweries that have operated for generations are swallowed by larger entities. Mergers and acquisitions reshape the industry at a ferocious pace. By the middle of the decade, 6 giant brewing groups, what journalists call the Big Six, control the majority of British pub supply. Allied Breweries, Bass Charrington, Courage, Whitbread, Scottish and Newcastle, and Watney Man between them account for the overwhelming bulk of beer produced and sold in Britain. Truman's watches this consolidation from Brick Lane and makes a deliberate choice. It will not be absorbed. It will restructure instead. The decisions made during the 1960s are radical for a brewery with such a conservative heritage. The Burton Brewery, which has operated since 1873, is closed in 1971, a painful amputation, but a necessary one. The pub estate is rationalized. Non-performing tied houses are sold. Investment is concentrated on the Brick Lane site itself, which receives significant modernization. The workforce is reduced. Costs are cut. And the strategy works. By the end of the 1960s, Truman's profits have grown by a third in just 4 years. The brewery emerges from the turbulent decade as the last major independent brewery left in London. It is a genuine, remarkable achievement. The Black Eagle is still flying. The chimney is still smoking. The barrels are still rolling. But here is what nobody in the boardroom sees coming. While Truman's has been focused on brewing, a different kind of predator has been circling. Not another brewery, a hotel group. Sir Maxwell Joseph's Grand Metropolitan Hotels is one of Britain's most aggressive conglomerates of the 1960s and 70s. It is not interested in beer in any meaningful sense. It is interested in the assets that brewing companies control: the land, the buildings, the pub estates with their tied house agreements, the property portfolios accumulated over centuries. When Grand Metropolitan looks at Truman's, it does not see 3 centuries of brewing heritage. It sees 12 acres on Brick Lane and hundreds of public houses across London and East Anglia. In 1971, Truman's becomes the target of a bidding war between Grand Metropolitan and Watney Man. The battle is fierce. The financial offers are large. And Truman's board, accountable now to shareholders who want maximum return, not maximum beer quality, accepts Grand Metropolitan's offer. The last independent brewery in London is sold. The Black Eagle, which has flown above Brick Lane since the year of the Great Fire, passes into the hands of a hotel company that will prove to be its executioner. 1972 to 1979. London. The destruction happens quickly. Grand Metropolitan has barely finished the takeover of Truman's before it turns its attention to Watney Man, completing that acquisition in 1972. The deal is the largest corporate takeover in British history at that point, valued at £405 million. The two companies, Truman's and Watney Man, are merged into a single entity, Watney Mann and Truman Breweries. In a single stroke, the brewery that has operated under its own name since 1666 becomes a subsidiary brand within a corporate structure whose primary interest is not the beer in its barrels, but the yield on its assets. The changes that follow are made with the confidence of executives who believe they understand markets better than the men who have spent their careers brewing. The first casualty is the name itself. Truman, Hanbury, Buxton and Company, the proud partnership that had carried the names of the brewery's great leaders for over a century, is shortened to the single word Truman. The heritage is erased in a memo. The brand identity is redesigned. The traditional Truman's Black Eagle, recognizable to generations of East End drinkers, is removed from the livery. Then they change the beer. Draft Cask Ale, the form in which Truman's had served its customers for 3 centuries, is switched to keg beer. Pressurized, pasteurized, shelf-stable, cheap to produce, convenient to distribute, and, according to the growing number of drinkers who notice the change, significantly inferior in taste. Across Britain, an organization called the Campaign for Real Ale, CAMRA, is founded in 1971 specifically in response to this trend. Its founders argue that the keg revolution is destroying British beer culture. They are not wrong. The consumer backlash is real and it is measurable. Sales of the new formula, keg-dispensed Truman beers, fall. Meanwhile, the Campaign for Real Ale names Watney Mann, and by extension the Watney Mann-Truman enterprise, as the primary villain of British brewing. Pubs that once relied on Truman's generations of loyal customers find those customers going elsewhere, to regional independents who still serve proper cask ale. The Grand Metropolitan Boardroom eventually acknowledges the error in the grudging way of large corporations that have damaged something they do not fully understand. Cask beer is reintroduced, hesitantly and partially, under a product called Truman Tap Bitter. The traditional Black Eagle returns to some packaging, but the reconnection with the customer is never fully achieved. The damage is done. The trust is broken. Meanwhile, on Brick Lane, the buildings age without adequate maintenance. The empire that seemed permanent now seems uncertain. The question being asked behind closed doors at Grand Metropolitan headquarters has nothing to do with the quality of the malt or the care of the yeast. It is a simpler, colder question. How much is the site worth? 1980 to 1988, Brick Lane, London. The 1980s bring a certain chaotic energy to Truman's that disguises, for a few years, the terminal nature of its situation. Real ale is now respectable. CAMRA's campaign has been so effective that even the largest brewing conglomerates must pay attention to it. Watney Mann and Truman brings back cask beer more seriously. The iconic Truman's Black Eagle, which had been quietly retired during the corporate rebranding years, makes a modest return. New products are introduced. There are moments in the first half of the decade when someone looking at Brick Lane from outside might conclude that the brewery has found a new equilibrium. They would be wrong. The fundamental economics have shifted in ways that no cask ale revival can reverse. Lager is now the dominant growth product in British beer. Continental imports, Heineken, Carlsberg, Stella Artois, are taking market share from all traditional British ales. The Great Tide House model, which had guaranteed Truman's customer access for over a century, is being challenged by changing licensing legislation. And inside Grand Metropolitan's finance division, a calculation is being made that has nothing to do with the heritage of the Black Eagle or the loyalty of East End drinkers. The Brick Lane site, 11 acres of prime urban land in the heart of what is increasingly a valuable property market, is worth substantially more empty than it is operating as a brewery. The logic of asset realization is cold, and it is final. The beer operation, even at its reduced and rationalized state, is still producing close to 1 million barrels annually. It is not an unprofitable business. It is not failing on its own terms. But a functioning brewery on 11 acres of inner London land generates less return than empty land available for redevelopment. The men who work at Brick Lane, some of them the grandsons and great-grandsons of men who worked there before them, understand what is happening before it is officially announced. The investment in equipment slows, the maintenance budgets tighten, the long-term planning that every industrial operation requires simply stops. When a business stops planning for the future, it is already decided to have none. In the mid-80s, Grand Metropolitan announces that Watney Mann and Truman will become, as a company document describes it, a single profit center. Brewery closures are coming. The question is not whether Brick Lane will close, but when. The answer arrives in the most brutal way possible, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a slow erasure. One by one, the functions of the brewery are wound down, the workforce reduced, the equipment left to sit. The Black Eagle is still carved above the archway, but the brewery beneath it is already dying. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to us and allows us to keep bringing you stories like this one. The final collapse of Truman's is as dramatic as its rise. Let's continue. 1989, Brick Lane, London. The end comes in 1989. After 323 years of continuous brewing on the same plot of East London ground, the Black Eagle Brewery produces its last barrel of beer, its last delivery is made, and the great chimney goes cold. The closure is announced with the corporate language of rationalization and restructuring, the sort of language designed to describe catastrophic decisions in the most inoffensive possible terms. It is not, of course, a rationalization. It is the erasure of an institution. The journalist Roger Protz, who grew up in East London and drank Truman's beer as a young man, makes the bitter observation that the closure makes no business sense unless your only interest is owning and selling property. He is precisely right. The brewery at the time of closure is still producing close to 1 million barrels annually. It has found a new, modestly successful position with its cask ale products, including Tap Bitter and Samson Strong, which have genuine followings among the East End drinkers who grew up with the Black Eagle label. The operation is not a failure on its own terms. But Grand Metropolitan's terms are not brewing terms. They are property terms. The 11 acres of Brick Lane are worth more without the brewery than with it. The decision to close is not made in a pub. It is made in a boardroom. And the men who make it have never pulled a pint in their lives. The workforce disperses. Some of the men have families who have worked at Brick Lane for 3 generations. They leave with redundancy packages and the knowledge that the skills they have spent careers developing, the management of yeast, the understanding of malt chemistry, the art of producing consistent beer at industrial scale, are no longer wanted in the place that taught them. The horses are long gone. Now the brewers follow. The buildings themselves survive, saved by their Victorian solidity and eventually by their listed building status. The engine house of 1867, the vat house, the director's house, the boiler house with its soaring chimney, all remain standing, solid and silent. The Black Eagle is still carved above the gate. The word cooperage is still etched into the lintel on Spittle Street. The architecture of a 3-century empire endures. Only the purpose for which it was built is gone. And then, perhaps most painfully of all, the brand itself. Scottish and Newcastle, which has absorbed Grand Metropolitan's brewing interests, finds itself in possession of the Truman's name and simply does not use it. No production is transferred to another site. No continuation is attempted. The name is simply warehoused, unused, for over 2 decades. As if 300 years of history can be quietly forgotten. 1990 to 2010, Brick Lane, London. The decade after the closure is a strange, transitional time for the brewery site. The buildings are too large, too historically significant, and too solidly constructed to simply demolish. And in any case, the listed building protections on the key structures make wholesale clearance legally impossible. For several years, the site sits in an ambiguous state, not quite abandoned, not quite repurposed, decaying gently around the edges while developers circle and heritage campaigners argue. The resolution, when it comes, is unexpected and in retrospect entirely fitting for East London. The Zaloof partnership acquires the site and begins a slow, organic transformation. Not into luxury apartments, not into corporate offices. The 11 acres of former brewery become a home for the creative class that is beginning to colonize Spitalfields and the surrounding streets. Artists attracted by cheap rent and plentiful square footage move into the old warehouses. Studios open in the fermenting rooms. Small businesses take the former cooperage and stable buildings. The backyard market launches in 2006, filling the yards that once echoed with the sound of dray wagons, with the sounds of vintage traders, artists, and food stalls. The Sunday upmarket follows. The old dray walk, where the wagons were loaded for delivery to pubs across East London, becomes a thoroughfare lined with bars and street food vendors. The transformation is not planned so much as it is allowed. The vast industrial space provides the canvas, and the community provides the art. By the mid-2000s, the Old Truman Brewery is one of the most recognizable cultural venues in London. Over 250 businesses operate across the site. Graduate Fashion Week takes up residence. The London Coffee Festival fills the yards. Street artists paint the walls that once bore nothing but brickwork. The Truman's chimney, which once signified industrial dominance, becomes an art world landmark, a destination for photographers and tourists who may not even know what it once produced. But something is missing. The ghost of the brewery is present everywhere. In the carved stone eagles above the gates, in the word cooperage etched into the archway, in the iron structural elements visible in every converted space. What is absent is the beer itself, the soul of the place, the thing that the chimney was built for. And then, in 2010, two men decide to do something about it. Their names are James Morgan and Michael George Hemis. They are East Londoners. They are beer enthusiasts. And they are about to perform what can only be described as an act of industrial resurrection. 2010 to 2013, East London. James Morgan and Michael George Hemis spend their days in the reading rooms of the London Metropolitan Archives, working through ledgers and records that trace the history of the Black Eagle Brewery back across centuries. They are not historians. They are brewers, or they intend to be. Their mission is to bring Truman's back, not as a nostalgic imitation, as the real thing. In 2010, they purchased the Truman's brand name from Scottish and Newcastle. The price is not disclosed, but the symbolic weight of the transaction is immense. A name that has existed since 1666, that has been associated with the royal household, with the abolition of slavery, with Charles Dickens and the East India Company and the largest brewery on earth, is now in the hands of two men who simply love beer and believe that East London deserves its brewery back. The challenge is immediately practical. They have the name. They do not yet have a brewery. For the first years of the revival, they produced Truman's beer under contract at Everard's Brewery in Leicester and at Nethergate Brewery in Essex. These arrangements allow the brand to re-enter the market, to appear on pump clips in London pubs, to re-establish consumer recognition while the search for a permanent home continues. By 2011, their flagship beer, Truman's Runner, named after the traditional term for a session ale, is available in over 150 pubs across London. But the most extraordinary element of the revival involves something that has been frozen since 1958. When the Black Eagle Brewery closed in 1989, samples of the original Truman's brewer's yeast were preserved at the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in liquid nitrogen, at a temperature of -196 degrees Celsius. For over 2 decades, the biological soul of Truman's beer, the living organism that gave the beer its unique character, its specific flavor profile, its connection to everything brewed under the Black Eagle label since at least the 19th century, has been suspended in cryogenic sleep. Morgan and Hemis retrieve it. The yeast is revived. Truman's beer, brewed with the same living culture that produced the porter served at the cabinet dinner of 1831, flows again. It is not metaphorical continuity, it is biological continuity. The centuries-old cycle of East End brewing has quite literally resumed, in the most direct sense imaginable. In August of 2013, the new Truman's Brewery at Hackney Wick, a 40-barrel plant on Stour Road, just miles from the original Brick Lane site, is completed. The official opening is held in September. Old employees from the original brewery are invited. Some of them stand in the new brewhouse and smell the malt and say that it smells right. It smells like Truman's. 2013 to the present day. East London. The revived Truman's Brewery operates out of Hackney Wick for several years, building its range of beers and its reputation across London. The Truman's Runner, the flagship session bitter, becomes the anchor of the lineup, a nod to the 19th century terminology for a working man's everyday beer. New products follow: the Zephyr Pale Ale, the Gypsy Queen Oat-Infused Seasonal, the Bold Raw Lager served in tank format at selected pubs. The old names gradually return. The brand that seemed permanently extinguished is unmistakably, stubbornly alive. In 2019, the operation relocates to a larger site at Black Horse Lane in Walthamstow in northeast London. The move enables expanded production and the creation of a community-oriented taproom and event space, a different model from the original Tied House empire, but one that reflects the ethos of modern craft brewing. The brewery is not trying to become the largest in the world again. It is trying to be the best version of what Truman's was always meant to be, a great East London brewer connected to its community, honest in its ingredients, consistent in its craft. Back on Brick Lane, the story takes another extraordinary turn. In 2023, brewing under the Truman's name returns to the original site itself. The owners of the old Truman Brewery, the cultural complex that has occupied the 11 acres since the 1990s, acquire the rights to the Truman brand. Production, in small batches through arrangements at Brockley Brewery in southeast London, begins again. The tap room on Brick Lane serves Truman's beer in the shadow of the old chimney, yards from where Joseph Truman first began in 1666. The architecture continues to draw visitors who may not fully understand what they are looking at. The Grade 2 listed structures, the engine house, the vat house, the boiler house, are now recognized as some of the finest surviving examples of Victorian industrial architecture in Britain. The carved Black Eagle above the gate has been there since the 18th century. The word cooperage still marks the archway on Spittal Street. The clock tower on the vat house still keeps its place in the Spitalfields skyline. But the question that hangs over everything, and it is a question without a clean answer, is whether what exists today is truly Truman's, or whether Truman's died in 1989 and what exists now is something new that carries an old name. The yeast says one thing, the history says another. The beer drinkers of East London, who can now again order a pint with the Black Eagle on the label, may not care much about the philosophical distinction. They just want the beer, and the beer is back. Go to Brick Lane today. Stand in front of the archway on the southern end of the old Truman Brewery complex and look up. The Black Eagle is still there, stone, weathered, defiant. It has watched over this corner of East London since Benjamin Truman's time, through the age of steam, through 2 world wars, through the corporate raids of the 1970s, through the silence of the 1980s and 90s. It has watched the garment workers and the market traders and the artists and the tourists come and go. It has watched London change into something nobody in 1666 could have imagined. If you look closely enough at the site today, at the ironwork and the converted warehouses, at the cooperage lettered into the arch, at the chimney rising above the Sunday market crowds, you begin to understand what 3 centuries of industrial history actually looks like when it refuses to entirely disappear. And what lessons does it leave us? 3 stand out, each harder than the last. The first is that size is not protection. Truman's was, at its peak, the largest brewery in the world, 400,000 barrels a year. The East India Company, the Russian court, the royal household, Charles Dickens, Parliament, none of it protected the brewery when the ownership changed and the priorities shifted. The greatest threat to Truman's did not come from a competitor who brewed better beer. It came from a hotel company that looked at 12 acres of East London and saw something other than a brewery. Scale creates the illusion of permanence. It is only an illusion. The second lesson is that the custodians of an institution matter more than the institution itself. For most of its history, Truman's was steered by people who cared about the beer. Benjamin Truman, who invested every spare resource back into expansion. Samson Hanbury, who drove the steam engine revolution. Thomas Fowell Buxton, who combined commercial genius with moral courage. When the brewery passed to Grand Metropolitan, it passed to people whose primary interest was not brewing. An institution is not defined by its buildings or its name or even its history. It is defined by the people who tend it. When those people stop caring, the institution is already dying, regardless of what the production figures say. The third lesson is about resurrection, and it is the strangest and most hopeful of the 3. Something that has been frozen, literally frozen, in liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees can come back to life. The yeast that made Truman's Porter in the 1830s is still making Truman's beer today. 323 years of continuous brewing. A 18-year pause. And then the chimney, cold for a generation, begins again in another building a few miles away, carrying the same living culture, the same name, the same eagle. At its peak, the largest brewery in the world, 400,000 barrels annually, 11 acres, over 1,000 tied pubs, 323 years in continuous operation from 1666 to 1989. What is left? A building, a chimney, a carved stone eagle, a frozen yeast culture that refused to die. And the beer itself, still being made, still being poured, still carrying the name of a man who walked into a small brewhouse on a muddy East London lane in the year the city burned down. The fire went out in 1989, but the Black Eagle is still watching. And the brewing, slowly, quietly, defiantly, has begun again.